Single-player games aren't dying, but they are becoming a rare breed. We just don't see them that much from the likes of EA Games or Activision Blizzard anymore. But we are seeing one group buck this trend and another change what it means to be a single-player game. In today's deep dive, we are going to cover the past, present, and future of single-player games. Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of The Deep Dive. So, when EA cancelled Ragtag, the Uncharted-like Star Wars game by Visceral Studios, one of the reasons why is that it was a one-shot linear campaign game. The problem being for EA was that essentially they wouldn't be able to turn it into a years-long money-making machine. Even if it had tacked on multiplayer, it just would not bring in those microtransaction dollars that the publisher really wanted, especially when they are used to the likes of FIFA Ultimate Team in terms of revenue. On the face of it to audiences, it looks like utter unrealistic greed. It seems like publishers are focusing on complete domination of markets rather than having a diverse portfolio of titles. Yet in the middle of all of this stands one publisher. Above all, Sony, Uncharted, The Last of Us, God of War, Horizon, Spider-Man, all standout single-player titles that have sold tremendously well and have been loved by players and critics alike, with the more recent Naughty Dog games and God of War really maturing the medium, creating something truly special. Yet, just like EA, Sony is a company. They are here to make money through the medium of video games, and ideally, they'll grow more by making excellent games. For Sony, that seems to work. But from a player's perspective, when we look at EA and the like, well, things are rather bizarre. Here's the thing, what if I told you that God of War and Uncharted 4 brought in heaps and heaps of microtransaction revenue? What if I told you that in spite of them being single-player games with a campaign that most people just play once with light DLC, that they're actually fantastic continued sources of revenue? While they don't earn their money through FIFA Ultimate Team-like microtransactions or Overwatch-like loot boxes, they really do earn their money. And this cuts to the heart of the matter. Sony is a first-party publisher. They own the PlayStation platform along with its PS Store and PS Plus subscription service. They get a 30% cut from anything on the PS Store, plus a continued $6.99 a month from PS Plus. All the games that I mentioned are platform exclusives, so imagine this. Someone purchases God of War and gets a PS4, knowing that that platform has other great single-player games like The Last of Us, Remastered, and Uncharted 4 that they'll really enjoy. Okay, so with that, Sony get a bunch of upfront revenue from those games. Good for them. Now what if that person sees that PS Plus has some really good games? Maybe they want to play with their friends. Well, okay, now God of War has led to Sony getting $6.99 per month. Okay, but what if they purchase 4 games that year for £45 each? Well, if they purchase those from the PS Store, then Sony will get around £14, so a total of £56 in revenue from the store, from their cut. Of course, a lot more if those purchases are first-party exclusives. So in reality, if God of War is enough to get someone on the PlayStation platform, then that game is actually earning its sale price, then likely plus 100 a year just by getting someone on the platform. That's the power of system sellers, and that's why it makes so much sense for Sony to put a lot of money into them. Now, all of that residual income from the PS Store, from PS Plus, those store cuts, well, guess what? EA would not make any of that if they published Ragtag. And that pretty much is why you only see big single-player games from the first-party publishers for whom those games onboard people onto their platform, leading to years-long revenue streams being created. Of course, this is not to badmouth Sony or to make excuses for Electronic Arts. My goal here is to explain why things are happening in the way that they're happening. I think the more we all know that, and the more we're more educated in business models and how those business models drive the headlines, then we're better able to understand how things happen, and if you're better able to understand how things happen, well, then I think we all better know how to effect change, if that is indeed what we want to do. So, how have EA decided to combat this problem? Well, I would say Origin Access. That is them attempting to build their own platform that will allow them to unlock a bit of that residual income, but I don't see it being as successful as what a first party does. That's why we see, for an example, Anthem, BioWare's big title, be very different. It bears more of a resemblance to Destiny, of course, than really to anything else that studio has made in the past, and from a business model perspective, one can really see why. If Mass Effect is to have another DLC, well, that DLC actually has to be made, and that's a hell of a lot more work than just adding a new 3D model to a loot crate, adding in some, percentage change modifier to the game world, or maybe, some shaders to a bright engram. The optimist in me thinks that Origin Access exists with the goal of maybe making the future of EA indies, Dragon Age, and Mass Effect be the equivalent to EA's system seller, something that, gets people onboarded onto their platform, perhaps allowing their standout games to act as a gateway to their live service titles such as the Anthems and the Battlefields, and maybe that would make it financially sensible for them to invest heavily in single-player quality games. But you know what? I don't really think that's going to happen. EA have been burned by Mass Effect Andromeda, they've obviously cancelled one of their major Star Wars efforts with Visceral Games, Anthem ended up being a big problem, and Dragon Age 4, we now know, very much is going to be a live game. Moving past EA, well, we've seen Activision Blizzard struggle even more. Benching the Blizzard titles for a second, we see that Activision is right now pretty much just Call of Duty. More so than any other publisher, they have been unwilling to have their first-party studios work on quality-focused single-player targets, although that had been less their jam for quite some time. And perhaps Sekiro could indicate a change in position, but still, it's early days. What about Microsoft, though? Because they're really important here. They aren't making big system seller single-player games that are our equivalent to, say, Oscar bait, right, from the movie industry. Why is that? Well, it's mostly because they lost the platform more. They have embraced cross-platform a lot more. They clearly view Xbox differently, with all future Microsoft games coming out on both Xbox and PC, with them basically just being two different types of hardware that all access the same platform, the Xbox platform, which itself is beginning to evolve. Now, this isn't ideal for Microsoft. They don't get to have that big walled garden that Sony does, complete with the alluring titles like God of War to draw people in. Indeed, Microsoft really has lost out this generation, and unlike Sony, many of their exclusives have fallen flat. They've underwhelmed. They almost seem to want to operate like more of a third-party publisher in terms of how their lineup of games works, perhaps indicating their desire not to be over-reliant on the success of their hardware. And then we have Ubisoft. They're a company known for making immersive single-player games, especially with Assassin's Creed. Well, okay, they do have, The Division, which is a pretty different game, but as for Assassin's Creed, well, it's now crammed with microtransactions. As much as I found Odyssey very enjoyable, you basically did have to purchase an XP boost if you wanted to play that game with decently balanced progression. So they're in a very awkward position. They are trying to bring their most iconic franchises into the era of live services, but still have them be single-player quality games. And it's often very awkward. So when we look across the most major players in the industry, it's a rather bleak picture. Sony are pretty much the only people with who you're going to get an uncompromised single-player experience. But that's because their platform gives them the business model to support that type of game having an additional revenue stream. No one else in their current operation is really able to do that, bar perhaps Nintendo with the Switch. And what do I mean here? Well, being large publicly traded companies, they're going to find it hard to justify creating games that will have a moderate budget, sell pretty well, and make a median profit. All the companies now are ravenous with grand plans of market domination over users' time and their chosen niches. Creating the next Fortnite or Call of Duty will massively increase your stock price, and ultimately, while studio heads might not have that as their goal, while the publishers who give them their money, they do. Ultimately, from their perspective, if EA were to make Senua's Sacrifice, yeah, they'd turn a profit. There'd be a wave of great PR. But it probably wouldn't make all the money in the universe, or, more realistically, enough to kick up the company's stock price in the eyes of the financial sector. It doesn't really come down to a grand conspiracy against single-player games. It comes down to examining the incentive structures of those who hold the most power within the industry. By understanding their goals and how their business models work and what influences them, we really do see why different companies focus on different types of games. For Sony, with their business model, single-player quality games really work. But for EA, it's all about the desire for the next FIFA Ultimate Team. Does the CFO, COO, or COO really care about the games that much? Probably not. And even if they do, they're probably going to be overridden by the random corporate pressures that exist in that world. So I'm open to the idea of there being nasty operators out there, but for the most part, I think this is a problem of basic economics. Those economics depend on consumer behavior, and it's our choices that create the conditions under which these companies operate. It's not all doom and gloom, though. We do have the likes of Life is Strange, of Senua's Sacrifice, coming out and doing very well indeed. These are examples of games that will never make enough to put you on the Fortune 500, but they are games from competent developers with well-managed budgets and decent marketing that turn a good profit. For companies who are not saddled with layers and layers of corporate overhead, they're actually a fantastic business model, allowing those studios to create some of the industry's most interesting content. And yeah, well, Ninja Theory did get purchased by Microsoft, so I mean, I'm a little bit worried about that one, but I think you get the point here. Finally, it's very important to call out when the big publishers actually do well. Many of them do have indie labels. EA's EA Originals label has the likes of A Way Out, Sea of Solitude, Unravel, and Fee. Ubisoft have their own indie initiative, Microsoft published Ori, Square Enix run Square Enix Collective, so some of these publishers could be learning here. While there may be a split in thinking between their indie wings and their main operations, this is another area where our industry could actually see positive growth, perhaps seeing that space of AA games like Senua's Sacrifice be a more regular fixture in our industry, which personally I would love to see, because you know what, as much as all the money in the world can lead to, a beautiful game like God of War, I mean from a, that was really expensive to make perspective, ultimately, creative, beautiful decisions don't require such a high budget. They don't require everything to be absolutely cutting edge and the most expensive available. So that AA space really is where I'm going to be looking for a lot of future innovation. Unfortunately for me, in an era where AAA is basically just companies trying to make big live games, it's just a bit worrying. Now that said, the only other thing I would like to say is, a big grats to Capcom actually, because Devil May Cry sold super well, and that's a game that's actually pretty just stand-up great. Monster Hunter World sold really well, and that's another game that's just a fantastic game. So while many of the big Western publishers may be struggling here, it is worth calling out the people who are doing a pretty good job. So there you go, that is a bit of a deep dive into the various different business models of the big publishers, of the big companies, and how those business models actually dictate the games that they end up making. I hope you found this interesting. The next deep dive is available on the Patreon right now, and a massive thank you to the patrons who helped to make this series what it is. This typically isn't tied to the big headlines of the day, it doesn't pull in the big views, but you know what? This is some of the most enjoyable content to make, and I'm so thankful to them for allowing me to be able to make it. So, thank you very much for watching this video, and with that, I'll see you next time.